The monarch butterfly resting on my finger weighs less than half a gram. So light it feels more like an idea than a living creature, more like a thought made visible than flesh and chitin and wing membrane. Yet this impossibly delicate being, with wings spanning barely 10 centimeters, is preparing for a journey of 3,000 miles. From the milkweed meadows of southern Canada to the Oyamel fir forests high in the mountains of central Mexico, it will fly distances that would be impressive for birds many times its size, navigate across a continent to a destination it has never seen, and do all of this powered by nothing more than nectar from flowers and fat reserves stored in its slender body. I'm standing in a meadow in southern Ontario in late August, surrounded by the orange and black flutter of monarchs preparing for migration. This is one of the northern breeding areas where monarchs spend the summer, feeding on milkweed and reproducing across multiple generations. But now, as days shorten and temperatures begin to drop, something remarkable is happening. The butterflies emerging from their chrysalises are different from their parents and grandparents. These late summer monarchs are the migratory generation, and they're physiologically distinct from the summer breeding generations that preceded them. The differences are profound, though not immediately visible. While summer monarchs live just 2 to 6 weeks, reproducing quickly and dying, the migratory generation will live 8 to 9 months, an order of magnitude longer. Their reproductive systems are immature, suspended in a state of diapause that allows them to conserve energy for the long journey ahead. Their bodies accumulate fat reserves that constitute up to 30% of their body weight, fuel for the marathon flight to Mexico. And somehow, through mechanisms scientists are still working to fully understand, they know which direction to fly. The monarch on my finger finally takes flight, joining dozens of others circling in the afternoon sun. They're feeding actively on late summer flowers, goldenrod, asters, joe pye weed, taking advantage of the nectar abundance to fuel up before beginning their journey. Some are already oriented southward, drifting in that direction even while feeding, responding to internal compasses that tell them Mexico lies that way, though they've never been there, though the journey will take them across landscapes they've never seen. Monarch migration represents one of nature's most remarkable phenomena, a multi-generational relay where no individual butterfly completes the full cycle. Yet the species as a whole maintains a precise migration pattern that has persisted for thousands of generations. The butterflies overwintering in Mexico will return north in spring, but they won't make it all the way back to Canada. They'll breed in the southern United States, lay eggs, and die. Their offspring will continue north, breed, and die. 2 or 3 more generations will pass during the summer, each pushing the range further north, until finally, in late summer, the migratory generation emerges, and the cycle begins again with the southward journey. This means that the monarchs I'm watching have never experienced migration before. Their great-great-grandparents made the journey south last fall, but these individuals are doing it for the first time, guided by inherited instructions encoded in genes and hormones, expressed through neural circuits that detect day length, temperature, and the sun's position. They carry no map, receive no instruction from experienced travelers, yet they'll navigate with precision to forests they've never seen. The biological mechanisms enabling this navigation are being revealed through painstaking research, though mysteries remain. Scientists have discovered that monarchs use a time-compensated sun compass. They can determine direction based on the sun's position, and they account for the sun's movement across the sky throughout the day, something that requires an internal clock calibrated to the 24-hour day-night cycle. This clock resides partly in the antennae, and monarchs with painted antennae lose navigational ability, proving that these seemingly simple sensory structures contain crucial timing mechanisms. But the sun compass alone isn't sufficient. Monarchs also fly on cloudy days and even in moonlight, suggesting additional navigational tools. Evidence suggests they can detect Earth's magnetic field, providing a backup compass when the sun isn't visible. They may use polarized light patterns in the sky, visible to their compound eyes but invisible to humans. They likely learn landscape features, following coastlines and mountain ranges that funnel migration routes. And they may use genetic information about target latitude and longitude, inherited instructions that guide them toward the Mexican overwintering sites their ancestors used. I've decided to follow the monarch migration myself this fall, traveling south roughly parallel to their route, stopping at key locations where they concentrate, observing their behavior and the landscapes they traverse. It's a journey I've dreamed of making for years, and this year the circumstances finally aligned. Time available, health adequate, and a growing urgency driven by the alarming decline in monarch populations over recent decades. The eastern North American monarch population has decreased by more than 80% since the 1990s, raising serious concerns about this migration's future. The causes of decline are multiple and interconnected: loss of milkweed due to agricultural intensification and herbicide use, loss of nectar resources along migration routes, climate change affecting both breeding and overwintering sites, pesticide exposure, and possibly disease. Monarch conservation efforts are underway across their range, but success requires international cooperation. These butterflies connect 3 countries through their migration, and protecting them means protecting habitat in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. As the afternoon wears on, I notice the monarch's behavior shifting. More are flying south now, higher up, moving with purpose rather than the meandering flight of feeding butterflies. They're catching thermals, rising columns of warm air, and riding them upward, then gliding south, gaining altitude and distance without expending much energy. This is energetically efficient travel, allowing them to cover 100 kilometers or more on good days while consuming relatively little of their precious fat reserves. I watch the monarchs gaining altitude, their orange wings catching the late afternoon sunlight, becoming smaller and smaller until they're just orange flecks against the blue sky, then disappearing entirely. They're heading south now in earnest, beginning journeys that will take weeks to complete, carried on wings that seem impossibly fragile for such an undertaking. Each butterfly represents a small miracle of biology, a creature that weighs less than a paperclip, traveling distances that humans cover in hours by car, but which will consume much of the butterfly's 8-month lifespan. The physics of butterfly flight itself is remarkable. Monarchs don't fly like birds or bats. They don't generate lift through simple airfoil principles. Instead, their flight involves complex aerodynamics, including leading-edge vortices, wake capture, and clap-and-fling mechanisms where wings come together at the top of the stroke and peel apart, creating additional lift. High-speed photography and computational fluid dynamics have revealed that butterfly flight is far more sophisticated than early researchers imagined, involving precisely timed wing movements that create and manipulate air vortices to generate both lift and thrust. Monarchs are actually quite capable flyers despite their delicate appearance. In favorable winds, they can reach speeds of 40 to 50 kilometers per hour, though their typical migration speed is around 25 kilometers per hour. They can fly at altitudes exceeding 3,000 meters when conditions are favorable, riding air currents that carry them southward with minimal energy expenditure. and they demonstrate remarkable endurance. Radio tracking studies have documented individual monarchs flying continuously for hundreds of kilometers, stopping only briefly to feed before continuing their journey. I begin my own journey south the next morning, driving from Ontario toward the northern United States, following routes where monarchs concentrate during migration. The first major landmark is the north shore of Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes that monarchs must navigate around or cross. Large water bodies present challenges for migrating insects. No flowers for feeding, no place to rest, and winds that can blow butterflies off course or exhaust them before they reach the far shore. Monarchs generally avoid flying over large water expanses, instead following coastlines around lakes, concentrating at peninsulas and points where the distance across water is minimized. Point Pelee National Park, a narrow peninsula jutting southward into Lake Erie, becomes a concentration point for monarchs funneled along the lake's north shore. I arrived there in early September to find hundreds of butterflies clustered on trees and shrubs, resting and feeding, waiting for favorable wind conditions to make the crossing to the lake's south shore. Some years, when conditions align perfectly, warm temperatures, light south or southwest winds, thousands of monarchs will lift off simultaneously from Point Pelee, filling the sky with orange wings, creating one of North America's most spectacular wildlife displays. Today, the winds are not favorable, strong from the southwest, blowing directly from the direction the monarchs need to travel. So they wait, feeding on goldenrod and asters abundant in the park's meadows, resting on tree branches in loose clusters, conserving energy until conditions improve. This waiting behavior demonstrates decision-making that suggests monarchs aren't simply following programmed instructions, but are responding adaptively to environmental conditions, making choices that maximize survival probability. Research on monarch decision-making has revealed surprising cognitive capabilities. In experiments, monarchs learn to associate colors with nectar rewards, remember these associations, and apply learned preferences to novel situations. They show individual variation in learning speed and problem-solving approaches, suggesting personality differences. And during migration, they make complex decisions about when to fly versus rest, which routes to follow, where to stop for feeding, all while navigating toward a destination they've never seen based on inherited information and real-time environmental assessment. I spend the afternoon photographing and observing the waiting monarchs. Up close, the details of their wing patterns are stunning. The orange sections aren't uniformly colored, but show subtle variations in shade and intensity. The black veins create structural support while also playing roles in thermoregulation. And the white spots along the wing margins may serve as visual signals to other monarchs or as aposematic warning coloration advertising toxicity to potential predators. Monarch toxicity comes from their larval diet of milkweed plants, which contain cardiac glycosides, compounds that are toxic to many vertebrate predators. Monarch caterpillars sequester these toxins while feeding, concentrating them in their tissues, and the toxins persist through metamorphosis into the adult butterfly. Birds that attempt to eat monarchs often vomit violently and learn to avoid them, associating the distinctive orange and black coloration with the unpleasant experience. This chemical defense allows monarchs to fly boldly during daytime, advertising their presence rather than hiding, because most potential predators have learned, either through personal experience or evolutionary history, that monarchs are not good food. However, the toxicity defense isn't absolute. Not all milkweed species contain equally high toxin concentrations, And monarchs that develop on low-toxin milkweeds are less well defended. Some predators, particularly certain birds and mice at the overwintering sites in Mexico, have evolved tolerance to cardiac glycosides and regularly prey on monarchs despite the toxins. And the defense provides no protection against many threats monarchs face: habitat loss, pesticides, vehicle collisions, extreme weather events, highlighting that chemical defenses, while valuable, don't ensure survival in human-dominated landscapes. As evening approaches, the monarchs settle for the night, clustering on trees in protected locations. They prefer trees near water with branches that hang downward, providing shelter from wind and some protection from nighttime temperature drops. The clustering behavior itself provides thermoregulatory benefits. Many butterflies together maintain warmer temperatures than individuals would achieve alone, reducing the metabolic cost of surviving cool nights. In the Mexican overwintering sites, this clustering becomes extreme, with millions of monarchs packed so densely on trees that branches sometimes break under their collective weight. I camp nearby, falling asleep to the thought of those fragile travelers resting in the trees, waiting for favorable winds, each one carrying the navigational information that will guide it to Mexico, each one representing countless generations of monarchs that successfully completed this journey, each one facing an uncertain future in a rapidly changing world. The monarch migration is ancient. It evolved after the last ice age, when milkweed expanded northward and monarchs followed, establishing the pattern that persists today. For thousands of years, monarchs have made this journey, connecting northern summers with southern winters, cycling nutrients and energy across the continent, serving as pollinators, prey, and symbols of the interconnectedness of ecosystems across vast distances. But will this migration persist? The question weighs on conservationists who've watched monarch numbers plummet. Optimists point to the species' resilience, their high reproductive potential, and growing conservation efforts. Pessimists note that declines continue despite awareness, that the underlying drivers, agricultural intensification, climate change, habitat fragmentation, show no signs of reversing, and that once a migration is broken, restoring it may be impossible. Morning breaks cool and clear, with winds shifted overnight to blow gently from the northeast, perfect conditions for a lake crossing. By mid-morning, the monarchs sense the favorable conditions and begin lifting off, first individually, then in small groups, then in larger numbers, until dozens are in the air simultaneously, all orienting southward, all beginning the crossing of Lake Erie. I watch through binoculars as they climb higher, catching the favorable winds, becoming small orange dots against the blue expanse of water and sky, heading toward the barely visible shoreline 25 kilometers distant. The crossing is risky. If winds shift or strengthen, butterflies can be blown off course or forced down into the water, where they'll drown. If temperatures drop suddenly, their flight muscles may not function properly, causing them to lose altitude. Some monarchs making this crossing will not survive. Researchers estimate that water crossings cause significant mortality during migration, though precise numbers are difficult to measure. Yet the monarchs fly on, driven by imperatives encoded in their genes, trusting in wing and wind and the navigational systems evolution has given them. I drive around the western end of Lake Erie, following the land route, and arrive at the lake's southern shore by afternoon. Here, at parks and nature reserves along the Ohio coastline, I find monarchs arriving from their crossing, some landing immediately to rest and feed, visibly exhausted from their flight, others continuing onward with barely a pause. The successful crossers have accomplished a significant milestone in their journey, having navigated a substantial water barrier, conserving enough energy to continue while still carrying the fat reserves they'll need for thousands of kilometers still ahead. The landscape is changing as I move south, the northern hardwood forests of Ontario giving way to the mixed forests and agricultural lands of the U.S. Midwest. This agricultural matrix presents its own challenges for monarchs. Modern industrial agriculture emphasizes monocultures, vast fields planted entirely to corn or soybeans with minimal plant diversity. Herbicide use eliminates milkweed and nectar plants from field margins, roadsides, and fence rows where they historically grew. The landscape becomes a hostile desert for monarchs, offering neither food for adults nor host plants for caterpillars. Yet monarchs persist, finding resources in the remnant habitats that remain: small prairies preserved in parks and nature reserves, home gardens planted by conservation-minded citizens, highway rights-of-way managed to support native plants, marginal lands too wet or steep for agriculture where native vegetation persists. These habitat fragments function as stepping stones, allowing monarchs to move through otherwise unsuitable landscape, though the distances between suitable patches can be substantial, requiring butterflies to fly long distances without feeding or resting. I stop at a restored prairie in northern Ohio, where volunteers have been working for years to bring back native plants, including several milkweed species and numerous native wildflowers that provide nectar. The results are impressive. The prairie is alive with monarchs and other pollinators, demonstrating that habitat restoration can create oases for migratory species. The volunteers I speak with are passionate about their work, motivated by love of butterflies, concern for biodiversity, and desire to repair some of the damage industrial land use has caused. One volunteer, an elderly woman named Margaret, who's been working on this prairie for 20 years, tells me about changes she's witnessed. When we started, we'd see thousands of monarchs during peak migration in September. Now we're lucky if we see hundreds. It's heartbreaking, but we keep planting, keep hoping that if we provide habitat, they'll use it. Every butterfly that feeds here and continues south is a small victory. Her words capture both the dedication and the quiet desperation of grassroots conservation efforts. People doing what they can at local scales, knowing that larger forces drive declines, hoping that cumulative small actions might make a difference. Research suggests these hopes have foundation. Studies show that restored habitats are used by monarchs for both breeding and migration, that even small patches can contribute to population persistence, and that distributed networks of habitat are more valuable than single large reserves because they provide resources throughout the migration route. The challenge is scale. Monarchs need habitat across their entire range, breeding habitat in the northern United States and Canada, migration corridors through the central United States, overwintering sites in Mexico. Creating and maintaining this continental-scale network of habitats requires coordinated action across political boundaries, land ownership types, and competing land uses. Some progress is being made. Federal programs encouraging native plantings, state initiatives promoting pollinator habitat, private landowners participating in conservation programs, but whether these efforts are sufficient remains uncertain. I continue south through Ohio and into Kentucky, following the approximate route monarchs take, though individual butterflies show considerable variation in their specific paths. Some follow the Appalachian Mountains, using ridge systems as navigational guides. Others follow river valleys. Some take relatively direct routes, while others meander, possibly responding to local wind patterns or landscape features. Radio tracking studies have revealed that Even within a general southward trajectory, monarchs make complex movement decisions, sometimes backtracking or moving laterally, suggesting they're not simply following a compass bearing, but are navigating in more nuanced ways. The Appalachian region presents different habitat than the agricultural Midwest. More forest, more topographic diversity, less intensive agriculture, more small farms maintaining traditional practices. This landscape seems more hospitable to monarchs, offering more abundant nectar resources and more landscape heterogeneity. Yet it presents its own challenge. Mountains create barriers that monarchs must fly over or around, and the energy cost of climbing over ridges can be substantial for small insects already pushing the limits of endurance. I watch monarchs approaching a mountain ridge in eastern Kentucky, struggling to gain altitude, some making it over while others turn back or follow the ridgeline, searching for passes. The butterflies that successfully cross often arrive on the far side visibly exhausted, landing immediately rather than continuing flight. This is migration at the edge of physiological limits. Creatures designed for short flights from flower to flower, pushing their capabilities to cover continental distances, sometimes succeeding, but often failing, with success determined by individual variation, luck, and environmental conditions along the route. As I camped that night in the Daniel Boone National Forest, surrounded by the sounds of late summer, katydids calling, owls hooting, distant thunder from storms on the horizon, I think about the monarchs roosting somewhere in these mountains, clinging to tree branches, wings folded, conserving energy for tomorrow's flight. They've already flown perhaps 1,000 kilometers from their Canadian starting points, with 2,000 more to go. They've crossed the Great Lakes, navigated agricultural landscapes, climbed over mountains, all while carrying the map to Mexico encoded somehow in their nervous systems. The mystery of that encoded map continues to fascinate researchers. How does inherited information specify a destination the organism has never experienced? The answer seems to involve multiple components: directional information from the sun compass, possibly latitude information from day length, potentially magnetic field information providing additional positional cues, and almost certainly landmark recognition as butterflies approach familiar regions their ancestors used. These components integrate into a navigational system that, while not perfectly precise, gets butterflies to appropriate regions reliably enough that the migration persists across generations. The next morning brings overcast skies and drizzle, poor conditions for monarch flight. Cold-blooded insects need warmth to power their flight muscles, and butterflies struggle to fly when temperatures drop below about 15 degrees Celsius. Rain grounds them almost completely, their wings too delicate to shed water effectively, becoming waterlogged and useless until they dry. So, on days like this, monarchs wait, hidden under leaves or clinging to sheltered branches, burning through precious fat reserves while making no progress southward, hoping conditions improve before reserves run too low. I use the rainy day for research, visiting a university lab in Lexington where scientists study monarch navigation. The lead researcher, Dr. Elena Ramirez, shows me equipment used to test butterfly orientation preferences. We put monarchs in cylindrical chambers under controlled lighting conditions, she explains, and track which direction they try to fly. By manipulating light angles, temperature, and magnetic fields, we can determine which cues they're using for navigation. Her research has revealed that the time-compensated sun compass is remarkably sophisticated. The butterflies don't just know the sun is south at noon, she says. They know where it should be at any time of day, and they adjust their bearing accordingly. We can shift their internal clocks using artificial light cycles, and they'll misnavigate in predictable ways, proving the compass depends on that internal timing mechanism. But the sun compass isn't the whole story. Her lab has also demonstrated magnetic sensitivity in monarchs. When we put them in magnetic field chambers and rotate the field, they change their orientation accordingly. They seem to use the magnetic field as a backup system when the sun isn't available, or possibly to calibrate the sun compass. The mechanism of magnetic sensing remains unclear. It might involve magnetite particles in cells acting as tiny compass needles, or it might involve quantum effects in light-sensitive molecules called cryptochromes in the eyes. Both mechanisms have been proposed, and both might contribute. We discuss the genetic basis of migration. Migration is inherited, Dr. Ramirez explains, which means genes code for it somehow. We've identified several genes that differ between migratory and non-migratory monarch populations. Monarchs in places like Florida and Southern California don't migrate, they breed year-round. The migratory eastern population has genetic variants associated with flight muscle development, fat metabolism, and circadian clock function that differ from non-migratory populations. This genetic control means that migration is an evolved trait, shaped by natural selection over thousands of generations. Monarchs that migrated successfully reproduced and passed their genes forward. Those that migrated poorly, heading wrong directions, failing to build sufficient fat reserves, not entering reproductive diapause, failed to reproduce and removed their genes from the population. Over time, this selection refined the behavioral and physiological traits that enable migration, creating the system we observe today. But genetic control also means migration can be lost. If migration becomes maladaptive, if mortality during migration exceeds mortality from staying put, or if overwintering sites are destroyed, selection would favor non-migratory behavior. Some researchers worry that if monarch populations decline too severely, if too many butterflies die during migration, selection might favor giving up migration entirely, and the eastern population might become sedentary like their Florida relatives. Once lost, restoring a complex migratory behavior would be extremely difficult or impossible. The rain continues through the afternoon, so I visit a butterfly conservatory where captive-bred monarchs are on display. The facility breeds monarchs for education and research, carefully managing genetics to maintain diversity, supplementing wild populations when appropriate. I watch visitors, mostly families with children, delighting in the butterflies landing on their hands and shoulders, learning about metamorphosis and migration, developing connections with these charismatic insects. Education and public engagement are crucial for monarch conservation. Unlike some endangered species that live in remote wildernesses beyond public view, monarchs inhabit landscapes where most people live, depend on habitats that private citizens control, and are visible and accessible in ways that foster connection. This accessibility creates conservation opportunities. Millions of people can contribute by planting milkweed and native flowers, avoiding pesticides, supporting conservation policies, and spreading awareness. But it requires that people care, that they see monarchs as valuable and worth protecting. The challenge is that environmental concern competes with countless other demands on attention and resources. People face immediate pressures, economic challenges, health concerns, social conflicts that can make distant problems like butterfly conservation seem less urgent. And the incremental nature of environmental decline makes it easy to ignore. Monarchs declining by 20% over 5 years isn't obvious to casual observers, becoming apparent only through systematic monitoring that reveals the cumulative trend. By evening, the rain has stopped and skies are clearing. I return to the forest, where monarchs should be roosting, moving carefully through the understory, searching for the orange glow of clustered butterflies. I find them on a black walnut tree, perhaps 30 individuals clustered together on downward hanging branches, their wings folded, motionless except for occasional slight adjustments of position. They're conserving energy, waiting for tomorrow's warmth and sun, trusting that evolution has prepared them adequately for this journey. Looking at these roosting monarchs, I'm struck by the improbability of their existence. Consider what had to happen for these particular butterflies to be here. Millions of years of insect evolution producing the order Lepidoptera. Tens of millions of years of angiosperm evolution producing milkweeds with their peculiar defensive chemistry. Coevolution between monarchs and milkweeds allowing caterpillars to feed on toxic plants. Evolution of migration as glaciers retreated and suitable habitat expanded northward. And finally, the specific sequence of events that produced these individual butterflies, eggs laid on milkweed plants, caterpillars surviving predators and parasites, pupae successfully metamorphosing, adult butterflies emerging and beginning this southward journey. Each monarch represents a winner in nature's lottery, an individual that succeeded where countless others failed. Most monarch eggs never produce adults. They're eaten by predators, succumb to disease, die from weather exposure, or simply fail to develop properly. Of those that do become adults, most will not survive migration. The few that reach Mexico, that survive the winter, that return north in spring and breed, these are the winners whose genes propagate forward. The odds are steep, but monarch populations persist because reproductive rate exceeds mortality rate, barely enough to maintain the species, at least historically. Whether that balance persists in the Anthropocene, the current geological epoch defined by human influence, remains uncertain. Humans have altered landscapes, climate, and atmospheric chemistry at scales and rates unprecedented in the history of complex life. Species that evolved in stable Holocene climates over thousands of generations now face changes occurring within decades. Adaptations that worked for millennia may suddenly become maladaptive, and species with specialized requirements or complex life cycles may be particularly vulnerable because they depend on multiple factors, all remaining within tolerable ranges. The next morning breaks clear and cold, perfect conditions after yesterday's washout. The monarchs stir as sun hits their roost, warming their flight muscles. One by one they drop from the tree and take flight, orienting southward, climbing into the morning air, continuing journeys temporarily halted by weather. I watch them go, knowing that some will make it to Mexico, others won't. But collectively, they carry forward the migration, maintaining a pattern that connects past to future, that links ecosystems across a continent, that demonstrates nature's capacity for creating beauty and complexity and meaning without conscious intent, through nothing but the patient work of variation and selection across countless generations. I continue south through Tennessee, following the monarch's general route through a landscape of rolling hills, small farms, and fragments of native forest. The character of the migration is changing as I move deeper into the southern United States. Individual monarchs are spreading out over a broader front rather than concentrating at geographic bottlenecks like Point Pelee, and I'm seeing more butterflies because I'm catching up with those that left Canada earlier than the ones I observed in Ontario. By mid-September, the migration is in full swing, with millions of monarchs streaming south through a corridor several hundred kilometers wide that funnels through Texas toward the Mexican highlands. I stop at a small farm in Middle Tennessee, where the owners have dedicated several acres to pollinator habitat, native prairie plants that have been absent from this landscape for over a century. The farmer, a weathered man in his 60s named Tom, explains his motivation. My grandfather farmed this land and told stories about butterflies so thick during migration that they looked like orange clouds. I never saw that in my lifetime. By the time I was farming, monarchs were already declining. But I figured I could at least provide them some help, give them a place to feed and rest. His prairie is alive with activity. Monarchs feeding on blazing star, ironweed, and goldenrod, joined by numerous other butterfly species, native bees, and beetles. This diversity illustrates an important point. Habitat that supports monarchs supports entire communities of pollinators and other insects. Conservation focused on a single charismatic species often benefits countless others that share habitat requirements, but lack monarchs' public recognition. Tom shows me his milkweed patches where he's encouraging breeding. Monarchs pass through here in spring on the way north, and they lay eggs on these milkweeds. Then we get a summer generation that breeds here before the migratory generation heads south in fall. So this habitat serves double duty, breeding grounds and migration stopover. This multifunctional role of habitat across the annual cycle illustrates why protecting distributed networks of sites is more valuable than single large reserves. Monarchs need resources throughout their range and throughout the year. We discussed challenges he's faced establishing native plants. The hardest part is patience. Native prairies don't establish overnight. First year you plant seeds, second year you get mostly weeds, third year natives start showing up, and by year 5 or 6 you finally have something resembling natural prairie. Modern society doesn't do patience well, but nature requires it. These plants evolved over thousands of years. They're not going to recover in a single growing season. His observation about patience resonates deeply. Ecological restoration is fundamentally about working on nature's timescales rather than human ones, accepting that processes we've disrupted over decades or centuries won't be repaired in years. This long-term perspective is increasingly rare in cultures focused on quarterly profits and election cycles, yet it's essential for addressing environmental problems that unfold across decades or generations. I continue south into northern Alabama, where I encounter a different conservation approach: highway rights-of-way, managed for pollinators. State transportation departments control vast linear habitats alongside roads and highways traditionally maintained through frequent mowing that keeps vegetation short and dominated by non-native grasses. But some states are experimenting with alternative management, planting native wildflowers and milkweed, reducing mowing frequency, creating corridors of pollinator habitat that cross the landscape. The benefits extend beyond butterflies. Native flowers support native bees, which are more effective crop pollinators than introduced honeybees for many plants. Reduced mowing saves money and fuel. Deeper-rooted native plants stabilize soil better than shallow-rooted grasses, reducing erosion and maintenance costs. And the aesthetic improvement? Colorful wildflower corridors replacing monotonous mowed grass generates positive public response, building political support for continued programs. However, implementation faces challenges. Road crews accustomed to traditional mowing may resist changes to their routines. Some public members perceive unmowed areas as unkempt or neglected, not recognizing intentional habitat creation. And initial establishment costs exceed simple mowing, though long-term savings eventually offset upfront investments. These social and institutional barriers often prove more difficult to overcome than technical challenges, illustrating that conservation is as much about changing human behavior and perceptions as about managing landscapes. I'm approaching the region where monarchs from across the eastern United States and Canada converge, funneling toward Texas. The concentration is becoming noticeable. I'm seeing monarchs regularly now flying south along highways, feeding in any available flowering plants, sometimes landing on my vehicle when I stop. The steady stream of orange wings heading south creates a sense of urgency and purpose. Millions of individual decisions and flights adding up to a continental-scale movement visible from space in some years when conditions concentrate butterflies densely. In northeastern Texas, I visit a monarch way station, a certified site providing habitat specifically for migrating monarchs. The way station program, run by conservation organizations, encourages private citizens to create small habitat patches and register them, building a network of stepping stone habitats across the migration route. Thousands of way stations have been established, ranging from small urban gardens to large rural properties, collectively providing distributed resources that help sustain migration. The way station I'm visiting belongs to Maria, a retired teacher who's converted her entire yard to native plants. "People think I'm crazy," she laughs. "My neighbors have perfect lawns with not a weed in sight, and I've got this wild tangle of native grasses and flowers. But every fall when monarchs arrive, when I see dozens of them feeding in my yard, I know it's worthwhile. I'm providing something they need, helping them on their journey." Her yard is indeed impressive, well designed despite the appearance of wildness, with plants selected to provide continuous bloom from spring through fall, structural diversity creating different microhabitats, and water sources for butterflies to drink from. She's clearly knowledgeable, discussing plant species, bloom times, and butterfly preferences with expertise that rivals professional ecologists. This represents citizen science at its best. Individuals developing deep knowledge of local systems, contributing observations and data to broader research efforts, and taking concrete conservation action at scales that collectively matter. We watch monarchs feeding on her flowers, and she points out details I would have missed. A monarch with a torn wing still managing to fly and feed, another with unusually dark coloration, possibly indicating it developed on low-toxin milkweed, a third with a tiny tracking tag attached by researchers documenting migration routes. The tags are engineering marvels, weighing just 9 milligrams, printed with unique codes and contact information, allowing anyone who finds a tagged butterfly to report its location and contribute to understanding migration patterns. Tagging programs have provided crucial insights into monarch migration. Thousands of volunteers across North America tag monarchs during fall migration, and a small percentage, typically 1 to 2%, are recovered at overwintering sites in Mexico or during the return migration in spring. This low recovery rate is actually quite good for insect tagging, and the recovered tags provide direct evidence of migration routes, travel speeds, and connections between breeding and overwintering areas. As evening approaches, Maria points out monarchs beginning to roost in her pecan trees. They do this every night during migration season. Sometimes I'll have hundreds clustering together, and in the morning when the sun hits them and they warm up, the air fills with orange wings. It's magical. Her description captures the aesthetic and spiritual dimensions of monarch conservation. Beyond ecological or economic justifications, many people value monarchs simply because they're beautiful, because their migration is astonishing, because having them in the world makes life richer and more meaningful. Leaving northeastern Texas, I'm entering the final major leg of the migration, the convergence toward the Central Texas corridor, where monarchs from across eastern North America funnel together before crossing into Mexico. The landscape here is transitional between the humid eastern forests and the drier western plains, with more open space, scattered woodlands, and increasingly visible evidence of the challenges monarchs face. Highway shoulders are littered with dead butterflies, victims of vehicle collisions that kill countless migrants annually. Estimates suggest millions of monarchs die on roads each year, mortality that's largely invisible because individual deaths go unnoticed, but which accumulates to significant population impact. I stop at a roadside rest area and find the pavement scattered with dead and dying monarchs. Some were likely hit directly by vehicles, others may have been caught in turbulence created by passing trucks and slammed into windshields or pavement. A few are still alive but injured, crumpled wings making flight impossible, bodies damaged beyond recovery. There's nothing to be done for them individually, but their deaths underscore the reality that migration through human-dominated landscapes imposes heavy mortality costs that monarchs didn't face historically. The route through central Texas takes me through the hill country, an area of limestone hills covered with juniper and oak woodlands, grasslands, and riparian corridors. This region serves as the final concentration zone before monarchs enter Mexico, and local residents have noticed the phenomenon for generations. I speak with ranchers and landowners who describe vast clouds of monarchs passing through in good years, though most also note that numbers seem reduced compared to their childhood memories. One rancher, an elderly woman named Dorothy, who's lived here for 80 years, describes changes she's witnessed. When I was a girl in the 1940s, monarchs would cover every tree during migration. You couldn't walk outside without butterflies landing on you. We took it for granted. They were just part of fall, like leaves changing color. But starting maybe in the 90s, we noticed fewer coming through. Some years now, we barely see any. It's heartbreaking, like watching something precious slip away. Her observation aligns with scientific monitoring data, showing the eastern monarch population has declined dramatically since the mid-1990s. Multiple factors contributed. Glyphosate herbicide use increased dramatically, with adoption of herbicide-resistant crop varieties, eliminating milkweed from agricultural landscapes where it had persisted in field margins and fallow areas. Climate change brought more frequent extreme weather events that cause mortality during migration and at overwintering sites. Habitat loss continued across the migration route and in Mexican overwintering forests. And possibly, disease increased in response to stressed populations and changing environmental conditions. The exact contribution of each factor remains debated. Some researchers emphasize milkweed loss as the primary driver, noting strong correlations between milkweed abundance and monarch population size. Others argue that mortality during migration or at overwintering sites is more important, pointing to years when breeding appeared successful, but few monarchs reached Mexico. Still, others suggest multiple stressors interact synergistically, with populations weakened by one factor becoming more vulnerable to others. The reality likely involves all these mechanisms operating simultaneously, creating a multifaceted challenge requiring comprehensive solutions. I continue south toward the Rio Grande, the river that forms the border between Texas and Mexico. The landscape is becoming more arid, vegetation shifting toward mesquite, acacia, and cacti, adapted to limited rainfall. Monarchs are increasingly concentrated here, following the river valley, where moisture supports more vegetation and nectar resources are more abundant than in surrounding dry lands. I'm seeing more butterflies per hour now than anywhere else on my journey. Dozens visible at any moment, hundreds passing any given point each hour during peak migration periods. At a nature preserve along the Rio Grande, I meet with border region conservation workers who face unique challenges. Monarchs don't recognize borders, explains Miguel, a Mexican biologist working with his American counterparts on cross-border conservation. They migrate through both countries, depend on habitat in both countries, and protecting them requires cooperation across the border. But political tensions make cooperation difficult sometimes. When relations between governments deteriorate, conservation programs can suffer. The border region itself presents conservation challenges beyond politics. Border infrastructure, walls, roads, patrol areas, lighting, fragments habitat, and creates barriers to wildlife movement. Increased human activity associated with border enforcement can disturb sensitive areas. Yet the region also contains important habitat that both countries have interest in protecting, creating potential for conservation to serve as common ground that transcends political divisions. Miguel takes me to a location where monarchs cross the Rio Grande, funneling through a narrow corridor between developed areas. We've documented this crossing point through tagging studies, he explains. Butterflies that pass through here are often caught and tagged on the U.S. side, then recovered a few days later in central Mexico, directly documenting their route. Understanding these corridors helps us prioritize conservation efforts. We watch monarchs streaming across the river, flying low over the brown water, climbing the far bank into Mexico, continuing south toward mountains barely visible in the distance. The crossing seems almost casual. Butterflies that have flown thousands of kilometers treating this international border as just another landscape feature to navigate. Yet, for the humans working to protect them, this border represents significant challenges requiring diplomatic as well as biological expertise. As the sun sets, painting the sky orange and pink in colors echoing the monarch's wings, Miguel and I discuss the Mexican portion of the migration journey. From here, they fly about 1,200 kilometers south and west, crossing the central Mexican plateau, climbing into the mountains. The journey takes about 2 weeks typically, depending on weather. They're guided by mountains and valleys that funnel them toward the overwintering sites, the same routes monarchs have used for thousands of years. The specificity of those overwintering sites is remarkable. Monarchs don't winter just anywhere in Mexico. They concentrate in a few dozen sites located in the transvolcanic mountains at elevations between 2,400 and 3,600 meters in forests dominated by oyamel fir trees. These sites occupy perhaps only 25 square kilometers total, meaning millions of butterflies concentrate in an area smaller than many cities. This concentration creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities, makes monarchs accessible for research and ecotourism, but also means that threats to these small areas affect entire populations. The oyamel fir forests, where monarchs overwinter, have specific microclimatic properties that make them suitable for monarch survival. The elevation provides cool temperatures that slow monarch metabolism, conserving fat reserves, but not so cold as to cause freezing mortality. The dense forest canopy buffers temperature extremes, preventing lethal freezes on cold nights and excessive warming on sunny days. The trees provide substrate for clustering, and the clustered butterflies create microclimates that further stabilize temperatures. These conditions allow monarchs to survive 4 to 5 months without feeding, burning through fat reserves slowly enough to last until spring when they begin the return migration north. But these forests are threatened by illegal logging, climate change, and other pressures. Despite legal protection, Enforcement is challenging in remote mountain areas, and economic pressures drive logging for timber and to clear land for agriculture. Climate change is shifting temperature and precipitation patterns, potentially making current overwintering sites less suitable and forcing monarchs to seek new locations. And the concentration itself creates vulnerability. A single severe storm, wildfire, or other catastrophic event could kill enormous numbers of monarchs from across the entire eastern North American population. I cross into Mexico the next morning, following the monarch migration south from the border region into the heart of the country. The landscape changes dramatically, the relatively flat terrain of southern Texas giving way to the highlands of central Mexico with increasing elevation, more dramatic topography, and vegetation shifting from desert scrub to pine oak forests as I climb higher into the mountains. The monarchs are climbing too, using thermals to gain altitude, their destination, the Oyamel fir forests that crown the highest peaks of the transvolcanic belt, a chain of volcanic mountains running east-west across central Mexico. The journey through Mexico takes monarchs across diverse landscapes and ecosystems. They cross agricultural valleys where subsistence farmers grow corn, beans, and squash, using methods largely unchanged for generations. They fly over small towns and villages where people have lived in relationship with monarchs for centuries, incorporating them into local folklore and traditions. They navigate increasingly rugged terrain, following valleys between mountains, seeking passes where ridges can be crossed with minimal energy expenditure, all while maintaining their general southwestward trajectory toward the overwintering sites. I stop in the town of Angangueo, one of the communities closest to the major overwintering sites, arriving in late October as monarchs are still streaming in from the north. The town has embraced its association with monarchs. Murals depicting butterflies adorn buildings, local craftspeople sell monarch-themed artwork, and many residents work as guides or in other roles supporting monarch tourism. But the relationship is complex, shaped by history, economics, and conservation tensions. Monarchs have always been part of life here, explains Rosa, a local woman whose family has lived in the region for generations. Our grandparents told stories about them. They arrive every year around the Day of the Dead, and tradition says they carry the souls of deceased loved ones returning to visit. It's deeply spiritual, not just ecological. This cultural dimension adds another layer to monarch conservation. These butterflies aren't just biological phenomena, but cultural symbols woven into community identity and spiritual practice. The timing of monarch arrival around Dia de los Muertos, November Rojoth II, when Mexican families honor deceased relatives, is probably coincidence, but it's a powerful one that shaped cultural relationships with monarchs. The association of orange and black butterflies with returning souls gives monarchs sacred status in local communities, providing grassroots conservation support that complements scientific and economic arguments for protection. When monarchs arrive to fill the forests, it's seen not just as a natural phenomenon, but as a spiritual event connecting past and present, living and dead, earth and sky. However, economic realities complicate conservation. The mountain communities near overwintering sites are generally poor, with limited economic opportunities. Forests represent valuable resources, timber for construction and fuel, land that could be cleared for agriculture or grazing. Conservation restrictions that protect monarch habitat can conflict with residents' economic needs, creating tensions between conservation goals and human livelihoods. Successful conservation requires addressing these economic dimensions, providing alternative income sources or ensuring that conservation generates economic benefits for local communities. Ecotourism provides one such benefit. Thousands of visitors come annually to witness the overwintering monarchs, generating income for guides, hotels, restaurants, and craftspeople. The Mexican government has developed tourism infrastructure, establishing butterfly sanctuaries with visitor facilities, training local guides, and marketing the monarch phenomenon internationally. This tourism creates economic incentives to protect monarchs and their habitat, turning butterflies from competitors for forest resources into valuable assets worth preserving. But tourism also presents challenges. Visitor traffic can disturb butterflies, particularly during warmer periods when they're active and more sensitive to disruption. Trails and infrastructure fragment habitat and can introduce edge effects that alter forest microclimates. And if not managed carefully, tourism income can concentrate in few hands rather than benefiting communities broadly, limiting conservation support among those who don't benefit economically. I join a guided hike to one of the overwintering sites, the Cerro Pelon Sanctuary, a several-hour uphill trek through pine oak forest that gradually transitions to pure Oyamel fir as elevation increases. My guide, a young man named Javier, who grew up in Angangueo and has been guiding for 10 years, describes changes he's witnessed. When I started guiding, the monarchs covered entire hillsides. Every tree was orange with butterflies. Now, some years there are fewer. Some trees that used to hold millions might have only thousands. It's variable year to year, but the trend is concerning. His observations align with scientific counts showing high year-to-year variability in overwintering population size, but a long-term declining trend. The population is measured in hectares of forest covered by butterflies. At the population's peak, in the mid-1990s, monarchs covered about 20 hectares across all overwintering sites. Recent years have seen coverage as low as 0.67 hectares, a decline of over 95%. The 2020-2021 season showed some recovery to about 2.1 hectares, offering hope that populations might rebound, but numbers remain far below historical levels. We climb higher, and the forest changes character. The Oyamel firs become dominant, tall, straight trees with dense crowns and downward drooping branches that create the perfect substrate for monarch clusters. The understory is open, with little vegetation beneath the dense canopy, and the forest floor is soft with accumulated needles. The temperature is noticeably cooler than lower elevations, and there's a moisture in the air, a feeling of perpetual mist that keeps the forest humid even when it's not actively raining. Then I see them, the first butterfly clusters, hanging from branches like strange orange fruit. As we approach closer, the scale becomes apparent. These aren't small groups, but massive aggregations, thousands of butterflies per cluster, multiple clusters per tree, dozens of trees covered with butterflies. The monarchs hang motionless, wings folded, packed so tightly together that individual butterflies are barely distinguishable. The collective mass is so heavy that branches bend under the weight, creating living curtains of butterfly bodies. The sight is overwhelming, almost surreal. The contrast between the ordinary appearance of the forest and this extraordinary phenomenon occurring within it. The juxtaposition of countless individual butterflies with the single collective mass they form. The knowledge that these particular insects flew here from thousands of kilometers away, guided by inherited information. I stand quietly, trying to absorb and process what I'm seeing, while Javier maintains respectful silence, allowing the moment to speak for itself. As the sun rises higher and temperatures warm, the clusters begin to stir. Individual butterflies near the surface flex their wings, catching sunlight to warm their flight muscles. Then, as if responding to a signal, butterflies begin dropping from clusters and taking flight, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds, until the air is filled with flying monarchs, a blizzard of orange and black, moving through the shafts of sunlight penetrating the canopy. They fly to nearby streams to drink, having gone without water since arriving weeks ago, their bodies slightly dehydrated, but otherwise remarkably intact after the long migration. The flying butterflies create a sound, a soft rustling like tissue paper, the collective noise of thousands of wings beating simultaneously, a whisper that fills the forest. The air itself seems alive, orange and black particles swirling in complex patterns, butterflies circling, landing, taking off again, creating a dynamic system of constant motion within the larger stillness of the forest. Some land on the ground to puddle, extracting minerals from damp soil, while others settle on tree bark to bask in sunlight, and still others investigate the few flowering plants that persist at this elevation in late autumn. Javier explains that this daytime activity will subside as afternoon progresses and temperatures cool. By evening, they'll return to clusters for the night. During really cold periods, they might stay clustered for days or even weeks, not flying at all, just waiting for conditions to improve. They're in a kind of suspended animation, metabolism slowed, not feeding, just surviving on fat reserves accumulated during migration. It's remarkable that bodies so fragile can endure 4 or 5 months like this. The physiology enabling overwintering survival is indeed remarkable. Monarchs entering reproductive diapause at summer's end develop differently than breeding adults. Their reproductive organs remain undeveloped. They accumulate much larger fat reserves, their metabolism becomes more efficient at low temperatures, and their behavior changes to favor clustering and conservation rather than reproduction and dispersal. These modifications are triggered by environmental cues, shortening day length and cooling temperatures, that signal approaching autumn, and initiate the developmental program that transforms summer butterflies into migrating and overwintering forms. Recent research has identified some of the molecular mechanisms underlying this transformation. Specific genes involved in juvenile hormone regulation appear crucial. Juvenile hormone normally promotes reproduction and prevents diapause, so suppressing it allows the migratory phenotype to develop. Other genes affecting fat metabolism, flight muscle development, and circadian rhythms show different expression patterns in migratory versus reproductive butterflies. Understanding these genetic switches might eventually allow researchers to predict how climate change will affect migration timing and diapause entry, potentially informing conservation strategies. We spend hours in the sanctuary observing butterfly behavior, documenting conditions, simply experiencing this phenomenon that words struggle to capture adequately. I photograph butterflies and forest scenes, though I know images can't convey the three-dimensional reality, the scale, the movement, the emotional impact of being surrounded by millions of monarchs in this remote mountain forest. This is one of those experiences that must be lived rather than merely documented. The kind of encounter with nature that changes perspective, that reminds us the world contains wonders beyond ordinary experience. As we prepare to descend, I notice something concerning, evidence of logging in portions of the forest. Stumps of large oyamel firs indicate recent cutting, and openings in the canopy where trees were removed have altered the forest structure. Javier acknowledges this reluctantly. Illegal logging continues despite protections. It's difficult to enforce regulations in remote mountains, and some locals depend on forest products for income. Conservation is challenging when people are poor and forests represent valuable resources they're told they can't use. This tension between conservation and human needs is perhaps the greatest challenge facing monarch protection in Mexico. The overwintering sites lie within the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, established in 1986 and expanded in 2000 to encompass about 56,000 hectares. The reserve includes core zones where human activities are prohibited and buffer zones where sustainable use is theoretically allowed. But enforcement is limited. Economic pressures on local communities are substantial, and illegal logging continues at levels that threaten forest integrity. Satellite monitoring has documented forest cover changes within the reserve over time. While large-scale commercial logging has been largely controlled, small-scale illegal cutting by local residents continues. Degraded forest quality, even where canopy cover remains, and climate change appears to be affecting forest composition and health. The rate of forest loss has varied across years, higher during periods of weak enforcement or high agricultural prices that incentivize forest clearing, lower when conservation programs are well-funded and alternative livelihoods are provided. Conservation organizations have attempted various approaches to address these challenges. Payment for ecosystem services programs compensate landowners for maintaining forest cover rather than logging or converting to agriculture. Community forest management programs give local control over forests with technical support for sustainable management. Alternative livelihood programs provide training and equipment for beekeeping, sustainable agriculture, or ecotourism. These approaches show promise but face limitations. Funding is inconsistent, programs don't reach all affected communities, and some people remain excluded from benefits. The political economy of forest conservation in Mexico involves multiple scales and actors: federal environmental agencies setting policies, state and local governments implementing enforcement, conservation NGOs providing funding and technical support, local communities managing forests, and individual residents making daily decisions about resource use. Aligning these interests toward conservation requires ongoing negotiation, compromise, and recognition that conservation success depends on meeting human needs alongside protecting butterflies. Descending from the sanctuary as afternoon lengthens toward evening, I reflect on the miracle and fragility of what I've witnessed. That monarchs found these specific mountain forests thousands of years ago and have returned each year since, that they navigate here from across a continent using inherited instructions, that they survive months without feeding in these precise microclimatic conditions. All of this represents evolutionary refinement over countless generations. But evolution operates on time scales of thousands to millions of years, while the threats monarchs face operate on timescales of years to decades. The question is whether monarchs can adapt quickly enough to survive rapid environmental change. Some researchers are cautiously optimistic. Monarchs show behavioral flexibility. They've adjusted migration timing in response to climate shifts. They've learned to use novel food plants in some regions. They've established non-migratory populations in areas where year-round breeding is possible. This flexibility suggests potential for adaptation. But there are limits. Monarchs can't migrate if milkweed disappears. They can't overwinter if forests are destroyed. They can't survive pesticides toxic at any exposure level. Flexibility helps, but doesn't guarantee survival in the face of multiple simultaneous threats. That evening, I stay in Angangueo and attend a community meeting about monarch conservation. Local residents, government officials, conservation organization representatives, and tourism operators gather to discuss management of the upcoming tourist season, enforcement of logging restrictions, and distribution of conservation program benefits. The discussion is heated at times, revealing tensions between different priorities and stakeholder groups, but also showing genuine commitment to finding solutions that work for both monarchs and people. One elderly man, a former logger who now works as a guide, speaks about his changing perspective. When I was younger, I saw trees as resources to cut for income. I didn't think about butterflies. They were just insects, beautiful, but not important. But over time, watching tourists come from around the world to see monarchs, seeing my children learn about their migration, understanding how they connect our mountains to Canada and the United States, I came to see them differently. They're part of our heritage, our identity. Protecting them is protecting something that makes this place special. His comments reflect a transformation that conservation ultimately requires, shifting from seeing nature as collection of resources for human use to recognizing intrinsic value, ecological importance, and cultural meaning. This shift doesn't happen automatically or universally. It requires education, economic alternatives, and time for new values to take hold. But when it occurs, it creates conservation support that's more durable than regulations imposed from outside. The next morning, I rise before dawn to return to the sanctuary for one more observation before I must begin my own journey home. The pre-dawn forest is utterly still and cold, perhaps 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough that my breath fogs heavily and exposed skin stings. The monarchs are completely motionless in their clusters, in a state of torpor where metabolism has slowed to near zero, where they're barely alive in any active sense, just enduring, waiting for warmth that will restore movement and life. As the sun rises and first light penetrates the forest canopy, the transformation begins slowly. The clusters on the eastern side of trees receive sunlight first, and these begin to stir before those in shadow. Individual butterflies flex their wings slightly, the dark surfaces absorbing solar radiation and converting it to heat. The wing flexing increases gradually, more and more butterflies moving, creating shimmer and motion in clusters that were previously static. Then, as body temperatures reach the threshold for flight, around 15 degrees Celsius, butterflies begin dropping from clusters and taking wing. The morning flight is less chaotic than the afternoon activity I witnessed yesterday. These butterflies are focused primarily on reaching water sources to drink, having lost moisture overnight and needing to rehydrate. They fly purposefully toward the stream, land at the water's edge, and extend their proboscises to sip. Dozens cluster at good drinking spots, creating orange carpets along muddy banks, all peacefully coexisting, all focused on the essential task of hydration before the day's activities begin. I watch a single monarch closely as it drinks, observing the rhythmic pumping of its abdomen as it draws water up through its coiled proboscis, seeing its body visibly swell slightly as it rehydrates. This individual has completed an extraordinary journey, probably hatched in August, somewhere in the northern United States or southern Canada, spent several weeks feeding and building fat reserves, then flew upward of 3,000 kilometers to reach this exact forest, navigating by sun compass and magnetic field and inherited information, burning through fat reserves but arriving with enough remaining to survive months without feeding. Now, it's replenishing water, one of the few resources available in this overwintering environment. The butterfly finishes drinking and flies to a nearby branch where it spreads its wings to bask in the strengthening sunlight. I can see now that this is a male. Males have a black spot on each hind wing that females lack, a scent gland used during courtship that won't be employed until spring when reproduction begins. For now, this male exists in suspended reproductive state, his body designed for survival rather than reproduction, his purpose simply to endure winter and participate in the spring return migration and breeding. The return migration is remarkably different from the fall journey south. Monarchs that overwinter in Mexico don't fly back to Canada in a single journey. They live only 8 to 9 months total, and having spent 4 or 5 months overwintering, they have only a few months remaining. Instead, they begin the return journey in spring, flying north from Mexico into the southern United States where they breed, laying eggs on milkweed before dying. This first generation of spring lives only a few weeks, typical for breeding monarchs. Their offspring continue north, breed, and die. A second and sometimes third generation is required to fully recolonize the northern breeding range, with the final summer generation being the one that will migrate south again the following fall. This multi-generational return migration means that individual monarchs completing the fall migration south never experience the return journey or recolonization of northern ranges. The knowledge of the complete cycle isn't held by any individual, but is distributed across generations, each one responding to environmental cues and inherited programs that move the population north in spring and summer, then south in fall. It's a collective memory encoded not in individual experience, but in genes and hormones and neural circuits that have been refined by selection over thousands of generations. Javier arrives to guide a group of tourists, and I join them for the final portion of my visit. The group includes families with children, retired couples, serious photographers, and biology students, a diverse collection of people united by interest in monarchs. Javier provides bilingual interpretation, explaining monarch biology, migration, conservation challenges, and the cultural significance of butterflies in Mexican tradition. The visitors listen attentively, ask thoughtful questions, and photograph enthusiastically, their faces showing wonder and delight at the spectacle surrounding them. This ecotourism, people traveling specifically to witness natural phenomena, represents a powerful conservation tool. The economic value generated by monarch visitors provides tangible incentive to protect butterflies and their habitat. The educational impact shapes attitudes and behaviors, potentially influencing visitors' choices about pesticide use, habitat creation, and conservation support when they return home. And the experience itself, standing in an Oyamel fir forest surrounded by millions of monarchs, creates emotional connections with nature that can motivate long-term environmental concern. But ecotourism must be managed carefully to avoid becoming a threat to what it's meant to protect. Too many visitors, poorly managed trails, disturbance during sensitive periods, all can harm monarchs or degrade habitat. The Mexican sanctuaries limit visitor numbers, restrict access to certain areas, train guides in appropriate behavior, and maintain trails to minimize impact. These management practices balance access with protection, allowing people to experience monarchs while ensuring the butterfly's long-term survival. As the morning progresses and more visitors arrive, I decide to leave, wanting to preserve the quieter experience I had earlier and recognizing that the forest can accommodate only so many people before the feeling of wilderness is lost. I thank Javier, make a donation to the local conservation cooperative, and begin the long hike back down the mountain, my mind full of images, questions, and concerns about what I've witnessed. The descent takes several hours, and I use the time to process my thoughts about the complete migration cycle I've now followed from Canada to Mexico. I think about the challenges monarchs face at every stage: habitat loss in breeding areas, pesticide exposure, climate change affecting migration timing and success, logging threatening overwintering sites. I think about the people I've met working to address these challenges: farmers planting habitat, researchers studying navigation, conservation workers protecting forests, guides educating visitors. And I think about the monarchs themselves, going about their genetically programmed behaviors, unaware of the larger forces affecting their populations, simply living, migrating, surviving, or not surviving, based on the combination of their own capabilities and the environmental conditions they encounter. Reaching the base of the mountain and the town of Angangueo, I find preparations underway for Dia de los Muertos celebrations, altars being constructed, marigolds being arranged, families preparing to honor deceased relatives. The timing, with monarchs arriving just as these ceremonies occur, reinforces the cultural association between butterflies and returning souls. I'm invited to observe as a family places offerings on their altar: photographs of deceased grandparents, their favorite foods and drinks, candles, marigolds, and among the decorations, images of monarch butterflies. The family's patriarch, an old man with weathered face and kind eyes, explains the symbolism. When the monarchs arrive, we know our ancestors have returned to visit. The butterflies carry their spirits from the land of the dead back to the world of the living. We welcome them with altars and offerings. We celebrate their return, and when the butterflies leave in spring, we know our ancestors have returned to their rest. It's been this way for as long as anyone can remember. The butterflies are messengers between worlds. This spiritual dimension of human-monarch relationships exists alongside the scientific and ecological dimensions I've been focused on throughout my journey. For many people, monarchs matter not primarily because of their ecological roles or even their conservation status, but because they're woven into cultural narratives, spiritual practices, and community identity. This cultural value provides conservation support that's potentially more powerful than scientific arguments because it's rooted in emotional and spiritual connections rather than abstract concepts about ecosystem function or biodiversity. As I prepare to leave Mexico and return north, I spend a final day in the forests near the sanctuaries, reflecting on the complete journey I've made following monarchs from Canada to their Mexican overwintering sites. The migration I've traced represents one of nature's most extraordinary phenomena, a multi-generational relay covering thousands of kilometers, connecting ecosystems across a continent, maintained through inherited information passed across generations that never meet. It's navigation without maps, knowledge without learning, coordinated movement without communication between participants, all accomplished by insects weighing less than a gram. The scientific understanding of monarch migration has advanced dramatically in recent decades, yet fundamental mysteries remain. We know monarchs use a time-compensated sun compass, detecting polarized light patterns with their compound eyes and tracking time with circadian clocks in their antennae. We know they sense Earth's magnetic field, though the precise mechanism remains debated. We know they accumulate fat reserves that power migration and carry them through months without feeding. But we still don't fully understand how inherited information specifies destinations butterflies have never seen, how social aggregation at overwintering sites is coordinated, or how the multi-generational return migration reconnects populations to specific breeding areas. These remaining mysteries don't diminish the value of what we've learned. They highlight how much complexity exists in systems we might superficially dismiss as simple. A butterfly navigating by instinct turns out to employ sophisticated neural computation, integrating multiple sensory inputs, making adaptive decisions, demonstrating capabilities that challenge our understanding of insect cognition. The more we study monarchs, the more remarkable they become, the more we recognize that even small organisms with tiny brains can accomplish feats that would be impressive for creatures with much larger nervous systems. But scientific understanding, while valuable, isn't sufficient for conservation. Protecting monarchs requires addressing agricultural practices, land use decisions, climate change, economic pressures on rural communities, international cooperation between governments, and ultimately, the values and behaviors of millions of people across 3 countries. This social and political dimension is at least as challenging as the biological science, perhaps more so, because it involves changing human systems that are complex, resistant to change, and driven by factors that often work against conservation. I think about the people I've met during this journey who are working toward monarch conservation in different ways. Tom, the Tennessee farmer who converted acres to native prairie despite economic costs and community skepticism. Maria, the Texas teacher who transformed her yard into pollinator habitat and shares her enthusiasm with neighbors. Miguel, the Mexican biologist working across borders to coordinate conservation efforts. Rosa and Javier and others in Angangueo who balance their economic needs with growing appreciation for monarchs' cultural and ecological importance. Each represents a small piece of the distributed effort required for successful conservation of a migratory species whose protection requires action across its entire range. The conservation strategies that show most promise are those that provide benefits to humans while protecting monarchs. Ecotourism that generates income while creating incentives to protect habitat. Payment for ecosystem services that compensates landowners for conservation actions. Habitat restoration on working lands that integrates conservation with agriculture. Education programs that build appreciation and motivation for voluntary conservation actions by private citizens. These approaches recognize that successful conservation must work with human motivations and needs rather than against them, that protecting nature in the 21st century requires finding ways for humans and wildlife to coexist productively. Yet, even the most effective conservation strategies face challenges from forces operating at larger scales. Global climate change that's altering temperature patterns, precipitation, and seasonal timing in ways that disrupt migration and breeding success. Agricultural intensification driven by global commodity markets and food demand from growing human populations. Economic inequality that leaves many rural communities in poverty and dependent on resource extraction for survival. Political polarization that makes cooperation difficult even when solutions are technically available. These systemic challenges require responses at scales beyond individual conservation programs, requiring changes to economic systems, agricultural policies, climate agreements, and social priorities. I board my flight from Mexico City back to the United States, looking out the window as we climb above the mountains where millions of monarchs are spending the winter, and I feel a complex mixture of emotions: awe at what I've witnessed, gratitude for the opportunity to follow this migration, concern about the declining populations and the challenges monarchs face, hope inspired by the dedicated people working toward solutions, and uncertainty about whether those solutions will prove sufficient. The monarchs clustering in Oyamel firs far below will begin their spring return migration in a few months, starting the cycle again, maintaining the pattern for another year at least. But whether this migration persists across decades remains uncertain. The science is clear about what monarchs need: abundant milkweed and breeding areas, nectar resources throughout the migration route, protected overwintering sites in Mexico, reduced pesticide exposure, and stable climate patterns. The challenge is creating and maintaining these conditions across a continent in the face of competing demands and limited resources. Success will require sustained commitment, adaptive management as conditions change, and recognition that protecting a migratory species means protecting entire landscapes and the ecological processes that maintain them. As my journey ends, I think about the individual monarch I observed on my finger in that Ontario meadow at the journey's beginning. If that butterfly survived the migration, it's now somewhere in those Mexican mountains, clustered on an oyamel branch, living on stored fat, waiting for spring. The probability that any individual monarch survives migration to Mexico through winter and back north to breed is probably less than 50%. Most die along the way from predation, weather, exhaustion, or the countless other hazards migration presents. But enough survive to maintain the cycle, to perpetuate the migration, to sustain the phenomenon that has captured human imagination and scientific interest for generations. The future of monarch migration depends on choices humans make collectively about how we manage landscapes, what we prioritize, how much effort and resources we dedicate to protecting the natural world and the processes that sustain biodiversity. There are no guarantees. Species have gone extinct despite conservation efforts. Migrations have collapsed. Ecosystems have degraded beyond recovery. But there are also success stories. Species recovered from the brink, ecosystems restored, migrations protected. Monarchs still have a chance if we choose to provide what they need, if we recognize that their spectacular migration enriches our world in ways that justify the costs and compromises conservation requires. Landing back in the United States, I feel changed by this journey, carrying with me images of orange wings filling forest air, memories of conversations with people passionate about conservation, and renewed commitment to contributing to monarch protection however I can. The migration continues whether I participate or not, whether I care or not, following patterns established over thousands of years. But the migration's future isn't predetermined. It depends on countless choices by countless people, each one seemingly small, but adding up collectively to determine whether this remarkable phenomenon persists or is lost. I drive north toward home, passing through landscapes monarchs will traverse in spring, already noting milkweed and nectar plants along roadsides, already planning how I might improve habitat on my own property, already considering how to share what I've learned with others who might be inspired to help. The monarchs are spending winter in Mexico now, but in a few months they'll begin the return journey, and in late spring and summer, new generations will push north, recolonizing breeding ranges, and next fall, a new migratory generation will head south again, following the same sun compass and magnetic sense and inherited instructions that guided their ancestors. This cycle, ancient, vulnerable, magnificent, continues for now. Whether it continues indefinitely depends on choices we're making today and will make tomorrow and the day after. Every milkweed plant planted, every pesticide application avoided, every forest preserved, every policy decision made with consideration for migratory species, all of these contribute incrementally to either sustaining or undermining the migration. The cumulative effect of millions of small actions by individuals, communities, organizations, and governments will determine whether future generations witness the marvel of monarch migration or only know it through descriptions and photographs, a wonder that once existed but was lost. The monarchs ask nothing of us. They simply live according to their nature, following instructions encoded in their genes, attempting the journeys evolution has prepared them for. But in a world increasingly dominated by human activities, their survival depends on us recognizing their value, making space for them in our landscapes, and accepting some compromise of our short-term interests for the long-term persistence of this migration. This is the challenge and opportunity of conservation in the Anthropocene, choosing to share the world with other species, to maintain the processes that have created the biodiversity we inherited, to pass forward not just human civilization, but also the natural wonders that make Earth extraordinary. As evening falls and I near home, I watch the sunset painting clouds orange and gold, colors that echo butterfly wings, and I imagine the monarchs far to the south doing the same, roosting as darkness comes, clustering for warmth and protection, enduring another night, surviving to see another dawn. Their persistence over millions of years through ice ages and climate shifts and dramatic ecological changes demonstrates remarkable resilience. The question our generation faces is whether that resilience extends to surviving the particular changes we're imposing at the particular speed we're imposing them. The answer isn't yet written, and our choices will help determine what it turns out to be. Thank you for joining this journey following monarch butterflies across a continent, from Canadian meadows to Mexican mountain forests, discovering the science and wonder of one of nature's most remarkable migrations. If these stories of patient observation and natural beauty help you find peace and restful sleep, please consider subscribing to our channel. Each tale we share is an invitation to slow down, to appreciate the extraordinary phenomena happening all around us, and to drift into dreams, feeling connected to the living world. May you sleep deeply, dream of orange wings carried on invisible compasses, and wake with renewed wonder for the migrations that connect our world. Good night, and thank you for traveling this path with the monarchs.